Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
So if you'll pull up Zoom, like as if you're about to do a meeting, I can give you the meeting ID and passcode.
Actually, I think I might just use my own laptop because I don't think I have Zoom installed in this.
Okay.
Just my yeah.
We could like hook yours up to it, but
Yeah, I think it's just faster. Also, I like the keypad on this be much better than this.
makes sense.
And this will allow me to do more. This is philosophy,
And religious studies.
religious studies, yeah.
I have early modern philosophy down my hallway. Yeah.
I assume that, they had a crisis though in the spring semester.
Just please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
This
then,
building? Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, there's probably in the building. I heard a lot about that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Trust me, I knew a lot about it as well.
Oh, yeah, because Jamie got moved into Mills
Yeah.
for a temporary office.
So are you sending me the link?
We can-
No, I can give you the meeting ID. and
Oh,
passcode.
perfect. Then just one second. I'm just gonna download this file.
And they're like, sorry guys, you gotta like, please.
I just don't even know if they're using it, but I think I'm just gonna work with it.
Yeah, I mean,
I wasn't even part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's ridiculous. Like, that's so silly. That's so silly.
If I had a family member who had a significant sleep problem at work, it would cause me anxiety. If I would constantly be worried, I would think.
I would be like, hey, I love you, but you actually have to go stay in a hotel or something because this is causing me way too much stress.
Yeah. All right, so meeting ID,
898
yeah,
50
yeah,
97
yeah.
4107.
4107.
And first dibs on the snacks.
Passcode,
28
yeah.
76 08.
But you're really,
You should be good.
exactly, exactly. What's on that?
There we go.
Yeah.
Anybody else can make these snacks? No?
And
What did I do?
making you the co-host. I'll do the video. Oh,
Is that, there you are.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
oh, I need to.
Mhm. Can't like this more.
You can also keep your mic muted.
Yeah,
So-
yeah.
Okay, is that what you, okay, cool.
Go.
Plug this in. So I'm not the one that they see.
6 or 7 people at every time, right?
Probably.
Have you voted for it?
We did, I participated in others, not as the person giving the talk, but like in the fall, I did one, and it was such a small group.
I expect us to have a
You
big
sociology?
Today,
Mhm.
okay, well, you know your stuff.
Yes.
Okay, I need to put this on. What's your area?
Okay. You can throw it in the back of there or wherever.
I also served free. Jamie, I teach in philosophy. Great, yeah.
So do everybody have the option to share screen?
Hello, Jamie, how
How
are you?
you living?
I'm the son.
Yes, I made you co-host.
Okay, I had
So you
COVID.
should be able to, as long as
It
you
was
have it
time
on
and
Yeah.
and running.
it was bad. It was real bad.
Yeah, I had it over the winter break.
Yeah, so I'm still like kind of recuperating from that.
Okay.
But other than that,
I
pretty
think
good. Things
that's
are pretty
a relatively good
good. I
view.
need to catch up. on
And
the-
beautiful.
Okay.
I think that reading group died. It's okay.
We've only had one meeting.
Oh, no one
It's
came.
It's too.
So if no one comes, it's dead.
Too soon to call. It's too, we got one more. If no one comes to the second one, then it might be
I
dead.
think we should try for the second one.
Yeah,
I mean, cause I was so broken hearted.
well, I'm going to be,
We're continuing.
well, I'm going to be at the second one, so.
What are we talking about?
The Nietzschean self-reading group.
There's a book we are reading this semester. I'm refreshing my slides, like giving up a thought.
To be fair, That was a bad time to host it though, because it was at the same time as Majors Fair.
Right,
And like I had to go for sociology and anthropology, which is why I couldn't go.
and it was mostly like keeners like you, like people who are gonna represent their perspective.
Yeah,
Be good and want to read important books, yeah.
yeah, so I think.
That was true for a couple of people in philosophy too.
Yeah, so I think it was just like bad timing, really.
So you met Hampton, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We had a little chat earlier.
Yeah. Frank, you know Hampton.
I do indeed.
No, I don't know her.
I had. Have to?
I've only been to her house before.
You play games?
Hello. Get anywhere you want.
Afton showed me around.
But
Yes.
Pizza and Afton showed me some cool YouTube videos.
I saw you like an hour ago.
Yes.
I think I'm just gonna download those slides because they are causing issues.
there are drinks and snacks over here if you'd like.
Oh, yeah.
Help yourself.
I have parts of it.
Is by the philosophy study.
By the Steel Center. The Steel Center is a center that was created originally in the eighties and there was money given for a chair of religion. It was far more money than would pay for that. So what they did was create a center for the academic study of philosophy and religion. And over the years, there was a group that started on Fridays looking at dictionaries. They're dating about it. And that's how these discussions develop. And I'm the director of the Steel Center. And it's full on my role. But we host lectures.
Oh, that is weird.
Every semester we host lectures.
That is very strange. Hold on a second.
Wednesday afternoon discussions. We also have what I call worldview, word brunches, Thursdays.
And I don't know why that's not translating.
Now,
Not doing it.
highlighting.
That's so bizarre.
Like anyone can come.
It looks like it is on my
It
screen.
does.
Why do we have, wait, why have we not had one in like a year?
A worldview porch lunch?
I was gonna say, I've not heard of that.
It didn't happen last semester, I was too busy last.
Ooh.
There will be one this semester. Yeah. So.
That's what it is.
But one of the
Should I
parts
stop
of the
recording?
mission of the Steel Center is the celebration of
Okay.
interdisciplinarity and of the liberal arts in general. And so we often like to ask our colleagues in other disciplines to come in and talk about stuff. Right, makes sense?
Yeah. Oh, is this better?
Perfect. Well, yeah,
Oh, yes.
yeah,
Yes.
perfect.
Awesome. Okay, perfect.
Yay. Okay.
I'm just gonna line all the- Talking.
Yes. Exciting.
How are you all? Yeah. Are you also a first year student?
No.
Okay, you are.
Okay. Beautiful.
So you're
Thank
teaching
you.
gender and sexuality and here
We're doing this right now, next year as well, though.
as well? Yeah.
But this year, I'm also doing queer and feminist theories as a theory of blah, blah, blah.
And then next year you're doing, just so I can announce what you're doing.
I'm doing
Family,
sociology of the family, intersociology, and I'm doing social movements.
social movements.
Yeah, that is gonna be a new kind of one. And then in the spring, Middle East and North Africa. People of the Middle East and North Africa, like kind of following the series of courses we already had people off parts of the world.
Okay.
So like we're adding the Middle East and North Africa, and then what else in the social theory, that's the usual. Then I'm going to do other things.
So, and social theory is like, four majors courses.
Yes.
Yeah, it's.
I love social theory.
It's at different level, so usually it's not.
Yeah.
But the discussions in my free theory class go wild. It's like, I love it. Wild in a good way, like.
See, the way it was listed on the course, it was just topic sexuality.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that sounds okay. I had no idea it was gonna be
Which is
as
actually
cool as it sounds.
It's something I've been wanting to look into, and see what I can ask to allow the system to say topic is something, but then to allow the professors to rename the courses. Because that's how they were always done in where I was before, in Ohio and New York. They would say
It's a great time.
something,
It's so
then
good.
or like a few weeks before or something, once they know
That's how
who's teaching it, they
Fun fact,
rename
this
it
is this
also.
one's top, so I can- so
Yeah.
you're literally living it, like, yeah, living the high life, yeah.
Yeah, 200 level, 300 level, and 400 level special topic.
That's good.
I taught so many 200 level ones that we run out of number, and then it's like switch 200 to 200.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Are you gonna take late modern stuff? We're gonna do marks.
Ooh, a full class on Mars?
No.
I was like, that would
I
be.
mean, I actually considered that. I wanted to do like anarchism and Marxism in the 19th century. Do like political, do Kropotkin
Yeah.
and Marx, and then you move into contemporary stuff, but I'm not. I'm preparing the existentialist.
Yeah.
I can't really. No, I don't. You're not.
That's crazy. Fun time, yeah.
I was telling everyone else.
I love it.
Oh, yeah. They're giving me, he'll introduce you and.
Ah, yes, okay.
Yes.
Which is strange why they went through.
All right.
Very well.
Welcome, everybody, to the Wednesday afternoon discussion at the Steel Center. Today, we're pleased to have Dr. El-Amoor from the Sociology Department. He teaches sociology and studied at NYU, got a PhD at NYU in sociology of education. And focuses on gender and sexuality. He teaches a gender and sexuality class here, and next year we'll be teaching sociology of the family and social theories. And this article is forthcoming, right?
Yeah.
Going to be publishing this in Journal of Resistance.
Yeah.
It's called, right? And today I'll be talking about the queer concert, utilizing music for queering the Egyptian social and political uprising. So let's give Dr. El-Amoor a warm welcome.
Okay. Hello. So I'm just gonna dive in because there's so much I would like to talk about, maybe not even be able to cover it. So I'm just gonna get started. But in order to create some context, we're gonna look at being LGBT around the world, what it's like to be as such, because this is kind of important for the framing of what we'll be talking about. And then the Egyptian uprising / revolution in general. What is that about as well? Because also leave that framing a little bit. And then we will talk about the role of the US and the West in general in the LGBT context and why it's persisting or being shaped the way it has been. So we're gonna look at that in particular. And then we're gonna also look, kind of wrap it back again by looking at LGBTQ issues around the world in general, because you'll see how we tie it all together. So this is just a map. It's a pretty big one. You don't need to see all the details. I kind of took a screenshot of it, a particular one, but it's on this slide. Usually when we think about LGBTQ rights, the framing of them happens in 3 categories, which is the protection against discrimination component, or criminalization of consensual same-sex acts, or the legal recognition of families. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is that a lot of scholars are making the point that these are limited and they are not comprehensive for a lot of countries that we could be looking at. And that includes Egypt, but also in general, the whole Middle East and North Africa as a part of the world. So think about other ways we could measure LGBTQ friendliness and what it could look like if we were to step out of those three categories of measuring what it really is. How can we really decide if a country is actually LGBTQ friendly or not? So that's kind of a good question for us to get started with. Now, when we look at the recognition aspect, these numbers are a little bit maybe not up to date just because I haven't looked today at what the numbers are like. But when we look at recognition of families, marriage, partnerships, joint adoption deals and arrangements and processes, we're looking at some numbers of countries that have these as legal. But obviously, again, is this a representation of what the world is doing in terms of are we doing okay, are we not? And can we rely on only measures such as this? So that is one thing. But then I'm going to start going from global to narrowing things down a little bit and look at the Middle East and North Africa. MENA stands for Middle East and North Africa for those who don't know it. But when we look at that part of the world, we're looking at countries that persecute LGBT people can face the death penalty, people can face prison, it depends, and we have different colors here. One thing I do like to highlight when I look at this slide at countries looking at, in particular, Iraq, for example. Iraq, the people who have been doing this practice, which is the death penalty for LGBT people, is actually militias or the Islamic State, which their presence in that region has direct relation to the US invasion of Iraq. So these are all connected, and we cannot ignore the fact that these practices are also, in some ways, are also consequences of the US invasion of that particular part of the world. Now, Egypt, which is the country I'll be talking about more in just a couple of minutes, basically, according to this color, does not really have a specific legalization against LGBTQ people in any capacity, but that does not mean that there's no LGBTQ oppression in there. So we will be talking about that in just a couple of minutes. Now, just to kind of create a context for what I will be talking about, these look like they are random terms that are not related, but the idea of the Arab Spring broadly, which started in 2011, started with Tunisia and Egypt, and then we are looking at pop culture in the context of what I will be talking about, political Islam, the war on terror, the United States, ISIS, the Islamic State, I mean, and the idea of democratizing the world at the hands of the West and the changes of regime, what happens when we look at these processes, because the regime obviously changed in Egypt. So let's keep those in mind. And usually, I don't think we may not have too much time for this, but this is a short video that I normally like to show. But for those who don't know, we're not going to do it just because I don't think we will have time. But just to think about those uprisings and why they even started. When we think about it, a lot of it is economic, and meaning the socioeconomic of those countries has been really bad. But the other part of it has also been just civil rights and human rights and what the regimes that are governing these countries have been doing. In 2011, there was a particular case of a guy named Khalid Said, that a video of his death at 2 police officers in Egypt in prison was basically leaked and circulated. It went viral, and it is what basically created that whole chaos that ended up being an uprising / a revolution. And that is another kind of discussion to be having, because we're at a point where people are saying these are not even really real revolutions. They are not uprisings, definitely. They are not a spring, because they actually made the situation worse in some of these countries. So why are we even calling them a spring? Because spring is seen as a growth, thrive kind of vibe, which we don't really have in these countries anymore. But anyway, people had demands, mostly, again, civil and human rights, but also socioeconomic changes and liberties that were not really met. And that is what triggered it. And remember why I'm like, this is going to be kind of like, we'll see why the new regime kind of tried to use LGBTQ people in order to distract the rest of the world or the people in Egypt from the real issues by using LGBTQ individuals. So there's a particular way that this has happened. Now, just to create some context for those of you who are not familiar with Egypt, like I say, the uprising happened in 2011. The guy in this picture is Hosni Mubarak. He was basically the dictator or the person leading the regime there from the late 70s, no, early 80s, all the way till 2011. But to look in particular at the context of LGBTQ life in his time, before we look at the uprising, while he was there in charge, a lot of things were happening. First, we got crackdowns that used to happen from time to time. These targeted LGBTQ meeting points. That meant including exploitation of online spaces, including dating apps and other online spaces that LGBTQ people use, including Facebook and Grindr and other spaces. That led to arrests of LGBTQ individuals. Some examples of the major events that were happening, crackdowns that were against LGBTQ people in his time are in 2001 and 2003. 50 people were arrested on what is called Queen Boat, which is a gay-friendly club on the Nile River. And that is, if you have not been to Cairo, that is a common thing there to have some bars / restaurants and whatnot on boats. And then 21 of these people were basically trialed 3-year jail sentences. 2003, kind of similar event, Cairo's Nile Bridge, 62 people were arrested. And again, this is just a brief kind of set of examples of very documented long history of practices that happened during almost 40 years of his presidency. Okay, so I am gonna move on. So when we think about where do LGBTQ people appear in those uprisings, initially when they started happening, people, and including people who study LGBTQ issues and gender and sexuality in the Middle East and North Africa, thought that this would be a good time because it finally gave a moment of hope. There was a momentum. The entire region is uprising, a lot of lack of stability. That may mean that if LGBTQ people just push a little hard and they try to force themselves on what is going on, they may end up doing what? Finding some rights and starting again with recognition. And unfortunately, that did not happen. As I will be arguing, actually, the exact opposite has happened because LGBTQ people, instead of just getting some rights and recognition, they were the first victims to be used for political gain and for the new regimes that had just grabbed power in order for them to kind of create some stability and rely on, public morality and whatnot in order to sustain some sort of power. So this article that I'm talking about today in particular also uses a case study of a concert that happened in 2017 in Cairo, in Egypt, by a band named Mashrou' Layla. Mashrou' Layla is a Lebanese band. We'll talk about them, but this is basically kind of what happened there. Let's look at some stuff. So these are the members of the band, and then the picture on top is these are two individuals who are raising rainbow flags. That happened in that concert. These are two individuals who we'll talk about in just a second, but that crackdown, when it happened, it was because of those rainbow flags being raised that 85 people ended up being arrested, and that led to a major solidarity campaign globally around the world and having people protest, mostly LGBTQ people, protest around Egyptian embassies around the world in solidarity and against the crackdown that has happened to these people. But these are the two individuals from the previous slide on that picture. Their names are Sarah Hijazi and Ahmed Ala. They are both queer identifying, and they were fans of Mashrou' Layla. Now, you may think, why would these individuals even show up at a concert like this with rainbow flags to begin with, right? So that's a good question, and we will look into why the band basically is, and their fans, why are they even, where do they meet in that topic? So when that crackdown happened, more than 85 people were arrested, LGBTQ people. A lot of them, or most of them, were perceived as more effeminate gay men, or transgender women. More than 40 received prison sentences by January 2018. So we're talking about a time frame of 2 months post concert. And then a lot of, unfortunately, anal examinations and torture are used as tools to confirm whether people are LGBTQ or not, especially again, we're talking about gay men or transgender women. And then a major thing that basically allowed for this to happen or to continue once it did happen, there was a media blackout nationally by the federal government that basically made it impossible to talk about LGBTQ people unless it was talked about in a homophobic and transphobic way that basically fueled the discourse that we are talking about a public moral issue that should be silenced. So the two individuals, Sarah Hijazi and Ahmed Ala, ended up being released 3 months later, but unfortunately they did not stay in Egypt, they were exiled to Canada. And we will continue with that story in just a little bit. But like I said, there was a lot of international solidarity work that has happened when that crackdown happened. And it is, again, even though this is not the first time that this has happened in Egypt, and this is not the first time that LGBT people were victims of this. This was the first time that it actually attracted this much attention at the global level. And that is, we'll look into why. But also people use different ways to show how much they support people, including on social media, in particular on Facebook. But for instance, we can see in one of these pictures, the one that shows the violence that Christian Egyptians face. And this is kind of like, it might be, some people might think that this is about Christian supremacy or some sort of like Islamophobia, but the idea is to show that a lot of these people thought that the oppression is the same, because a lot of Christian Egyptians face a lot of violence, not at the hands of the governments always, but also at the hands of other people, and it went by without much or substantial response. And basically what it says here, it actually says it in English, we're living in a society that prefers watching these pictures over and over, rather than seeing young people holding rainbow flags. And then on social media, there was also the banner, which you can add to your profile pictures on Facebook. You still can do that, I think. I don't have Facebook, I'm not on it anymore. But that was a campaign that also attracted so many people, and people showed solidarity with them. So in the long-term aftermath of what happened, this is Sarah Hijazi in this picture. It's one of the graffiti that was done all over the world of her picture. And these were the two words in Arabic in the letter that she wrote when she ended her life by suicide. In Arabic, they say, "Walakinni usameh," but I forgive. Unfortunately, while in Canada in 2020, Hijazi decided to end her life. And the context of that, according to some documents that she left, her lawyers and her family, she basically only found limited relief when she was in Canada, and it got worse when she wanted to visit Egypt, but obviously she couldn't at the time that her mom was struggling with cancer and also died, and she couldn't be there when her mom passed away. So basically that is, they're saying what basically triggered and was the final event that just made it too hard for Hijazi, and that is why she passed away. Now, I'm sorry, I completely forgot to put a trigger warning on this, and I usually do mention it, but I hope everyone is okay. If you have to leave, that's absolutely fine. But then you may ask, who is this band and how can their concert be such a big deal, and why would it cause such a, like, why is it different? Because this is not a new type of oppression for LGBTQ people in that region. Now, they are an indie rock band. They sing in Arabic. They started as undergraduate students at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And they have a lot of things that make them unique. I wish we could look at some of their songs and lyrics, which is what I do in the article, but we don't have time to do that. But they have controversial lyrics for the region. They have also special videos that I think really stand out with the messaging that they have as a band. And they look at a lot of topics that are not normally discussed in the Middle East and North Africa. Interfaith marriage, LGBTQ oppression, women's rights, anti-government. They are also anti-corruption. They talk about refugee rights. They're secular, and they are also environmentalists. So to bring all of those issues together, that definitely makes them on top of the fact that they're openly queer members. Both the lead singer and one of the players are also openly queer, and that is just rare in the pop culture scene in the Arabic-speaking world in general. And they're just a grassroots cultural resistance. They just do it through a movement that does their work through music more than anything. But yeah, this is kind of who they are. I don't have videos, but I do have some images of their work that shows exactly how gender and a lot of other issues go into it. So we can look at, for instance, the top left image is basically taken from the Greek mythology in their album. Men wearing pink. There's a lot of pink in these pictures. On the top right picture, we're seeing a man who's wearing what looks like a wedding dress. That's also an issue. This is wearing those vests in the ocean was inspired by actually they combined a belly dancer image, which is a very Arab cultural symbol with refugees basically who were dying and as they crossed from the Middle East or North Africa all the way to Europe or the rest of the world. And then a lot of other issues, including this hat, for instance, that does show also kind of what is called, the Oriental Arab look. This is just kind of visuals of some of their work that show how they can be, for some people, seen as provocative in a lot of ways. So yeah. Now, why are they really worth the pen, besides what I've said about them and their work? This is another picture, not from the same concert, but they perform a lot. And this is just from another concert because they obviously have a huge, major LGBTQ fan base. And what really their work does is personal contentious agency, because these were talking about people who don't have that much agency normally in the normal settings that they live in. They create a safe space, which is also rare for the region. And they basically disturb and disrupt a lot of the rigid divide of what can be allowed in public versus what can be allowed in private. And then I'm sure many of us here know this, but music and art in general as forms of resistance, right? We can use art in all of its forms for resistance and creating solidarity. And I think the US alone has so many examples. But if we were to look at just music alone, we can look at the history of hip hop and jazz and whatnot, just to throw an example in there. But then they also definitely allowed some mobilization, like we saw. They literally actually managed to create or lead, unfortunately, it was not under good circumstances, but they managed to lead to a global international solidarity campaign because they also have fans all over the world, even though they only sing in Arabic. So all of that, yes, go ahead.
Just to clarify.
Yeah.
You call this a safe space and you say that they put on lots of concerts. Is it really safe? I mean, I know it is like for the attendees.
I would say without those flags, it would be, because it's not like usually, yeah, their concerts have happened a lot and frequently enough. And I think when we think of safe spaces, it could also mean in the private space, because if they're listening to that music and it gives them some sort of comfort, and it does a lot actually, because their lyrics is that way as well. I think that's also contributed, but just the fact that people know, at least their fans know, that they are queer and they're performing and they do have concerts pretty frequently and people come to see them. I think
I was afraid that the government might.
I mean, the crackdown is obviously, unfortunately, an example of it being not always a safe space, but in general, that was their goal. And there was, for the most part, they were able to create safe spaces. So yeah. But all of that is just to say that they're basically a threat to the stability of the broken governments that emerged in the Middle East and North Africa post these uprisings that happened in 2011. And that is why that crackdown happened. Now, when we look at it from a theoretical or literature perspective, we look at Michel Foucault's work, Biopolitics, which if you don't know what that term is, it's basically a discourse that looks at the state subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. And it depicts also another term within it, is also biopolitics, or the biopolitical management of citizen, which can include acts as extreme as people dying for the case of, for the sake of the state being able to manage the population as it would like. So this is kind of the frame that I put this whole case in. But then in this context, the state is perceived as all those things. It's a given. It's it has unlimited privileges. It constructs and builds itself through people. And it does that again, even if it means and includes sometimes people, citizens dying for that sake. And it basically just, it can go as deep and far as controlling citizens' activities in their most private and detailed levels. And that's why it includes also people's sexual lives and sexual identifications and sexual behavior and sexual performance. So again, it's permanent, it's sturdy, and it will do anything that threatens it. This is basically what Foucault is saying when it comes to the state and how powerful it is. So going back to laws and the legalization context and what it really looks like in a place like Egypt. So there is actually no explicit law, like I said, that criminalizes homosexuality, but there are two laws that have been used for decades now. One is the law against prostitution, and that goes to the 50s. The other one is the law against debauchery, and that goes to the early 60s. These laws, a lot of scholars argue, are actually the legacy, part of the legacy of the British mandate in the region, because they were either, they existed, some of them, at least the prostitution one, from before the British left the region. So it was at their work and it stayed. And to think about the fact that these laws are still used today is I mean, obviously it's insane, but also the fact that, again, when we think about the West versus the East and homophobia being a product of what, there's a lot of scholarship there that argues that it's actually the way homophobia, the way we see it historically, has existed just, I don't know, more in the West, and it traveled for a lot of reasons when colonialism happened and it traveled to the East. But all of that is just to say that a lot of the people who get arrested, not only in Egypt, but in a lot of parts of the world, they do not usually get arrested directly with laws that decriminalize LGBTQ people, rather according to laws that are such as this, that usually target sex workers and other groups that, or sodomy laws of some sort that are not always exactly like, you are just having same-sex sex. So, yeah. All right, so how does all of this anti-LGBTQ violence even become possible in Egypt? It's thanks to these few things. First off, I'm gonna start with the lowest one, which is the patriarchy. We're still talking about a patriarchal society, obviously. And then the whole public security concept that governments rely on, that we are worried about the public security of the people of this nation. This allows for it. And then the criminalization of producing, possessing, or distributing materials that violate, also kind of related to public security, but the whole idea of public morality. And that gets used a lot in these contexts. Like the morality of people is losing control. We need to contain it somehow. We make the public feel fearful about it. As a result, this allows that we can just arrest people and the public doesn't even react because they think that we're doing okay.
Do they have a definition of what they mean by morality?
Yeah, because I mean, in that context, it would be that local culture that sees that it's immoral to have same-sex relations or behavior or any type of performance related to that.
So it could be, they could really just use that for part of anything.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So basically what that means, again, to wrap all of that up, it just becomes a governance tactic.
it becomes a way, like I mentioned earlier, for political gain. Basically, we're distracting, again, the uprisings happen for socioeconomic reasons and for certain liberties and regime behaviors such as tortures and imprisoning people and freedom of speech and other rights that were not a thing. And we're just distracting people from everything that matters: inequality, police brutality, the economy, poverty, and other issues. And just saying, look, we are actually taking care of some things, such as containing this weird thing called LGBTQ people that is basically appearing around our culture and threatening it, right? So, yeah. You may also ask yourselves, where is the condemnation of official political leaderships around the world, like this country that we're in right now, and Europe and Canada? And guess what? For the most part, it's non-existent. And there are reasons for it. So from time to time, actually, the US does make statements when these events happen. And it actually did even in this case. They did say, we are gonna limit our funding from the US, which comes in the form of military aid to Egypt, if the human rights record does not get improved. But usually we're talking about massive sums of money that end up being kind of maybe cutting out, like, I don't know, like decreasing them, but just like a fraction, and making it look like we're actually punishing these governments when we are not. So,
Can I ask a question?
yes, absolutely, go for it.
So is the immorality, is it associated with the West? So this idea of an invasion of their culture by Western values and morals, and so if the United States were to react like that and strip funding, could it almost like put fuel on that fire and saying they're just trying to change the way like we believe, and does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and the reason they do it in a particular way is basically related to what I'm about to talk about, which is the war on terror. No, this is a good question, because like, what do you do when, if the West was to condemn it, but also this condemnation, all we care about, what are other actions they can take? And this is what the question that I'm more interested in. It's not just to say we condemn this thing. So the whole concept of the war on terror, a lot of you probably know the concept of the war on drugs, which happened here locally, which was basically just a way to sustain some sort of status quo when it comes to African Americans, and like it was a racist kind of tactic, let's call it, for the least. But then the same thing applies to the war on terror, which is in some ways, in a lot of ways, it's basically an invention that the West created in order, and by the West I mean not only, but particularly the US, in order to preserve a lot of its interests in regions such as the Middle East and North Africa. And that is done in a lot of ways, including deals with the governments that are existing in these countries. But think about it in terms of international relations, right? Think about the mutual interests of these Western governments, the elites in the Middle Eastern and North African countries. And what really it looks like is this. You may not know this, but Israel is the country that gets the most funding of military aid from the US all over the world. Number 2 is Egypt. Now, when I said earlier about condemnations, usually when they condemn such events, what they do is they reduce those massive numbers of funding, again, given for the war on terror, because we're trying to fight terror in these countries. What we do is just reduce it with with a million or two, and then say we are punishing these countries for their human rights records, when we know that these budgets are basically staying the same, and actually sometimes they only increase, regardless of the records that have been documented before. But we know that the US pays Egypt not for it to create its own military power with neighboring countries. It gives it to the elites in Egypt so they can use it in order to sustain stability inside of Egypt, because the US is interested in keeping some sort of a status quo in the region, because again, they don't want US interests to be bothered or hurt or harmed in any way. And that is why you end up with governments that have a lot of money. They use it to repress a lot of groups, And in order to create their own stability, what do? They start with the easiest victims, such as LGBTQ people. So, yeah. Scholar Scott Long I have a few kind of almost quotes from his kind of talk about this, and he's the main person who researches this topic, but he wants people to understand that there is so much that we can do about it, but it gets blocked because the US, he says, we want access to resources and the ability to keep others away from them. American ambitions have been exercised through anchor states, core allies whose job is to police the region and ensure stability for us. Think about traditional colonialism. Colonialism meant in the past that you have to physically go and invade countries, right? Today, you don't have to do that. You can maintain your colonialism indirectly without looking like you're even involved with it. Unless you're an intellectual person who watches too much news and reads too much, you will not probably search into how much the US funds in Egypt and how much the Egyptian government gets from the US. So this is what happens today, and this is why the Western influence on the rest of the world is still in place, because the US, like many other countries, including Canada, which I know most of you think is an angel state, it's actually just as corrupt, if not more, because it funds a lot of military and problematic things around the world as well. So yeah, this is what we end up with. Also, part of this is that we end up with militarized masculinities and militarized states. So we have states that are more militarized than anything, because the military is what really keeps them to sustain their power. But also as a result, because these become masculine military systems and systems of power that end up leading to, again, LGBTQ people are a threat to this masculinity. And anything that disrupts that should just disappear, even if we have to kill these people. So basically, this is kind of what it really ends up at. We rely on violence, the suppression of difference, the repressive cult of masculinity, and the patriarchal faith. All of those, they basically just keep societies in their place. Now, again, like I said, LGBT people are the easiest victim, but then how do we silence the whole nation? We basically perform crackdowns, like the one I mentioned following the concert. We control the media like they did, and they showed that the government shows people that queer danger is there, and it's actually that they are benefiting the Egyptian people as government by containing these people. So I'm gonna only look at the Obama administration part, because again, Obama, just because he's Black, people think that he's another angel. Respectfully, he's not. Just because of his race, he doesn't get some sort of a pass. He was more brutal than George W. Bush on the Middle East, in case you didn't know that. So respectfully, again, if you are offended, we can talk about this later, but that's another thing for another day. But the life or death of locals matters less to the Obama administration than the big picture, the preservation of American power. Now, the average American does not think in terms of foreign policy, usually, unfortunately. But look around you and see how many Americans are able to talk foreign policy, and what is the relationship of life here domestically to foreign policy and how it's done abroad, militaristically and in other ways. But again, a lot of these events happened immediately after the uprising, when Obama was still the person in charge. So that is why this scholar is aiming their work on the Obama administration. Now, a lot of people, as a result of these crackdowns, the average Western person thinks that what? Homosexuality and Islam are incompatible. Muslim people and the Arab world are homophobic people. They are backwards, they are barbaric, they are whatever you want to call it, but they don't know how people are being silenced. It's with Western money. And why is the civil rights situation not changing? And why are people unable to talk? And why do they die if they open their mouth? It's because there is Western funding that is allowing that. There is a system that the West funds that basically lets that happen. And just to, I'm gonna stop here. This is, I think, the last slide. This is the main takeaway of all of this. Egyptian activists, human rights activists, and LGBT activists among them want the US and its allies to cut or stop military aid to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. That's the person who took power after Mubarak, who has been allowing all those crackdowns. They want us, meaning the West, to stop propping up the murder regime. This, the US and NATO refuse to do. Who do we blame? I personally blame the West. Are there cultural and socio-cultural issues that are happening in the region that contribute to that? Absolutely. But the core issue right now is that people are silenced and unable to talk because there's militarized masculine systems in place that are funded by US taxpayer money. And I will pause here. If you have any questions, we can do that. Yes.
It's interesting to me because I see a few parallels between, I don't know, I'm sure most people here have been following the Arkansas legislature recently. I feel like there's a lot of scapegoating going on around trans people. Same with like a broken system, but they want that to be the problem that people focus on. So it's really interesting that that root is here, that it's can be traced to that happening in worse situations across the world as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's very relevant. I don't think it's different, obviously, but what we see happening right here locally is also related. Like the power dynamics behind these systems are really not that different. Like they are in some ways, but also there's a lot of similarities too.
It's the money elite that are threatened to lose position, and as long as you can distract from that and put regressive laws in place to, you know, we're kind of colonizing ourselves the way we're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, like the whole thing just like really ties together into the way that you can link militarization to patriarchy, to the way that it, and to like access to resources, how they are also intrinsically linked and reliant upon each other. Like an effect in one area is so deeply used, like, and even if you can't see it immediately, like when you stop and you parse the pieces together for a bit, it becomes so clear the way that like, yeah, Western power and the funding of these systems allows for not only like you were talking about like laws put in place, but also like the cultural aspect to it of like the way like how it having trouble with my words today. The way like, you know, even in a community that you're in, the way that like having that Western influence, even though it's the military, the way that that impacts ground level communities and how that reifies that system, so that even when if you were to immediately take the money out, it would still take time after that to move the cultural needle back again.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I wish more people would even bother to think about the connections of all these issues, because most of us, when we look at the superficial level of things, we can't really make those connections, but they are there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember you mentioning, was it biopolitics or something like that, that's like talks about your autonomy and the fact that there's this like unintentional thing that we do as a society that creates this like in control of the body. That made me think and apply a lot to what I was writing my research paper about.
Yeah.
Which is very similar in the way it's the US influencing the South Korean after the South Korean War, and they control military men by giving them sex. So like once again, it's military being like masculinized and pushed towards a heterosexual normativity, and just the fact that that's just reinforcing that once again is very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that you're giving us another example is definitely just another confirmation that this is Egypt and military and being a masculine thing that is not used only for border control or what we think it usually is, protecting the nation state in traditional ways. It's actually also about governing people domestically as well. So yeah, but I will say that I forgot to say this, but the band was banned from Egypt, obviously, after the concert, and then Jordan followed them as well. So they were banned from both Egypt and Jordan. And I forgot to add this slide, but also the band also dismantled itself just 3 months ago. Unfortunately, because there was a lot of hostility that kept coming and coming and coming, even though some of them now also live in the US. Because I think 2 of them are also, yeah, they were in New York for a little bit. Anyway, they also, as of now, the band is not a thing anymore, I think 3 months ago. So, yeah. Anyway, questions, yeah.
I just wanted to kind of comment on the thing about how the whole deal about US criticizing another country's on civil rights. And it's a rigged game, you know, this 3 to 5% deal that goes up, and it's a shell game. And then when you look at it, we would be reflective as Americans, and we would look at our civil rights. We're the country that has 6% of our population incarcerated. Egypt doesn't, not even North Korea.
Yeah.
And so the hypocrisy of it, I don't know how we live with it, really.
I think there is the term American exceptionalism that actually does describe that, where the US gets to practice certain things in other places, but then it does it for its own interests, and then it even allows things that it would not allow locally to happen. And that we saw that in Iraq, for example, with the torture of prisoners of the Abu Ghraib prison, which that was, some of you all might be too young to even remember that, but that was in the early 2000s, where literally the US military used homosexuality as a mode of torture against prisoners. And then at the same time, they said, look at us, look at how LGBT friendly we are. But then at the same time, it only was a reflection that at the end of the day, the US is still actually more homophobic than we would like to admit. Essentially.
And it was a dark prison too, no
Exactly.
better than a secret prison.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that also that kind of adds on to the point. It's the fact that, again, it comes down to who has access to resources and money, and that guarantees who has power. And it doesn't matter really what that institution of power says that they believe in, because they can say whatever they want and they can use their resources to create images showing that, when in actuality, their actions reveal, like you're saying, like deeper homophobia, deeper racism, classism, what have you, whatever, all the other oppressive things. And again, it's because when you have the most money in the room and you are the one controlling the resources, you get to do whatever you want.
There are other forms of power, I believe, that have historically and do stand up against and overthrow that power, but it doesn't go quietly in the night.
Absolutely, and I think if that was more just like how do we live with our hypocrisy? It's because like the easiest way I think is through the money and the fact that we can use money and resources pretty easily to like smooth it over. And so as long as you don't look below the surface, like we can kind of just that cognitive dissonance, I think.
Good.
Some of you may not know the term homonationalism also, and homonationalism is also another phrase that describes when nation states take actions in order for them to basically preserve or sustain their interests and gain power in a lot of forms using LGBTQ people and using claims of LGBTQ friendliness globally, again, in different kind of international relations and diplomacy platforms. Say, look how LGBTQ friendly we are, that means that we have legitimacy to do other things in other places because these people are homophobic, so they deserve what is being done to them, essentially. That is one way of, but yeah, homonationalism is also another term that goes pretty well in that.
Parallels with the reasoning to isolate Jews and the Holocaust and to demonize and so forth are just uncanny.
Absolutely, yeah.
Perfect parallel.
Know much about anti-LGBTQ policy or cultural norms before colonization, so it seems like part of the argument is that this.
Absolutely, that is actually what I look at, but more in the Palestinian context. So the idea is that in the non-Western world, homosexuality existed in 2 modes, either as a desire or as an act, meaning you could have homosexual desires or you would act on it, but it was never labeled as such. And as long as that happened, it was never a problem. There was no consequences for acting or desiring in a homosexual way. What happened is that when the West invaded, colonized these regions, it basically forced people to label themselves as such. And that is when homophobia emerged, especially when we look at the 60s and all the way through the 90s with the internationalization of human rights and especially LGBTQ rights. Like we know the queer scholars like Judith Butler and other people, they literally make it clear that the goal was to internationalize LGBTQ rights. And when that happened, without any consideration of the cultural context that were imposing these notions, because saying you're gay or queer in the US or in the West, it's not just about your sexuality, it's a political and social identity. And to take that model and just implant it in other nations and cultural contexts without thinking about what that may mean or how those practices existed before, that is why a lot of scholars have that problem with like, we're not actually inherently homophobic. Homophobia in the Arab-speaking world came from colonization and Orientalism. So, yeah.
To what degree is that Christian morality?
Oh, because Orientalism also obviously brought Christianity with it as well. Because homophobia emerged first locally in the West through Christianity, and then when the colonization happened, it traveled as a value to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Also interesting, kind of like the way that the structure of the family, like the nuclear family, that it's like really that was really developed to perpetuate capitalism of consumption and production, and the way that the West spreads that outward also carries with it like those notions of family and how you label yourself and how we're organized, like the way that that also like impacts these colonized countries. It's like capitalism plays such a deep role in it.
Oh yeah. I mean, because also colonialism, part of it was capitalist based.
Yeah.
Like it was these were the goals. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts about really interesting dialogue. You assign a lot of power to West or North America, Europe, etc. And I'm wondering what that leaves people in Egypt to do. So I guess I'm asking, if change can happen short of the United States deciding it's not going to send more military weapons to all sorts of places around the world, which seems like it's not going to happen, perhaps even in our lifetime. So short of that, what is the space for change look like?
I mean, it's very limited because the fact is that it's still, unfortunately, the new regimes that emerged in those countries are still relying on the same tactics from before in order to remain in their positions. And that includes torturing people, imprisoning people, and silencing people. So as long as these are still happening, I don't know what else could happen, but this case did show that there was some solidarity around the world that did happen that may help, but I don't think it would be a major shift in any way. If change does happen, it will be local. But while these things were happening, and even before them, that does not mean that there were no LGBTQ communities. These people were there, they still are there. They just lived in a different way. They had their own what is called underground cultures. They had their own spaces, they were more careful, they had to be cautious, but they existed amongst each other and they always found ways to survive until they had to die, unfortunately. But they did survive in a lot of ways. Questions? Yeah.
I am about to study abroad in Japan, so I've been doing a lot of research about that area. So I prefer not to be in the closet in the new place I'm in, but I want to just like know some of the cultural context. And I've really been thinking about what I read, which is kind of back to what we were talking about capitalism, because there it's more about you are not doing a productive role in society, producing more of your family, you're not having children. And so that's the real problem with it. And like the idea about productivity, your role as a human, and like what you add to society. And I'm sure that can be tied to maybe like a Japanese tradition in like upholding family values, but I think it's also probably capitalism too.
Oh, Japan has its own set of homophobia in so many ways too. So we can definitely I can see you build a lot on that. So yeah.
In terms of like the sort of crackdown on body,
Mhm.
biopolitical power? Is it like military or police or military police, or who are the people who are enforcing? And is the enforcement, is it like legal, or are there like, is it like morality they're enforcing, whether there are laws or not?
There
So
are
I
no
guess I'm
laws
asking-
because the
I'm asking,
regime,
like a question about like, where would the change have to occur? Like, is it that there needs to be laws? Or there needs to be a change in morality in order for there to be rights? Or does it need to be a change in the laws in order to capture the a change in morality? Or is it just,
Like
you
the
need to
social and the
not
political-
have
like the
power?
social versus the political kind of.
Right,
the-
like, is it a moral change, a legal change, or is it just power is
I
corrupt?
don't know if it's legal, it's more how much power is given to these people to begin with. But then the idea that they have police systems that in second can become militarized because they have more power than because like think about the US, you have police, but then you have, I mean, I don't know, think about the White House when they tried to invade it. You had to get more troops, you had to get actual more militarized power than just an average bunch of police officers, right?
Right.
So it's kind of the fact that those systems in there are overlapped domestically in so many ways. But then the idea that like in terms of legality, again, this system is, we're talking about regimes that don't care about anything else but remaining stable. And they will do whatever it takes, and that includes doing whatever they want, but I don't think the change can, as long as they have the money to impose those tactics, not much is gonna change. So if you were to ask me where it should come from, it's just to make them weaker, you need to give them less power, and their power as of now is allowed because of how much money they have.
Yeah, cause like when people think about human rights, it's like trying to change the legal structure internationally, or trying to change people's moral
In this
conceptions.
case,
We're just trying to change who has power.
in this case, it's, you need to look at the deals between Western governments and governments in the Middle East and North Africa. That's what I think. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And after spring break, we will have Dr. Michelle Merritt, an associate professor of philosophy from Arkansas State University. And she's been interested in the overlooked injustices of adoption. She's adopted herself, critiques right-wing people using adoption arguments against abortion. Examining the intersections among adoption, foster care, and child welfare system more generally, along with the broader connections between these forms of family policing and the carceral logic endemic to all of them. Dr. Merritt argues that adoption is far from the win-win it's often touted to be. Please join us in a couple weeks.